Are they a little emotional like me? Don't lie to me. Don't lie to me, people. So, as you can see just through watching this film, there's a lot of stuff that's happening in the history of the United States that a lot of times people don't feel comfortable talking about for many reasons, and that we're not really taught a lot of times, and it's a sad thing. So we wanted to provide this safe space for you guys to be able to vent if you need to, give your opinions, give your thoughts, as well as ask questions. So please feel free to be open, to be honest, and allow what you hear tonight to go with you outside of this. So I'm going to call up Loki, as well as Angela Taylor. She's in the chapter as well. They're going to coordinate this for us, and Angela will give us a breakdown of how it's going to go.
All right, how about that? Lima beans and barbecue. All right. All right, how about another round of applause for Loki? So I've been looking forward to this conversation all day. Had the opportunity to take a look at this film earlier today, and I have 3 pages of notes, 3 pages of questions to ask Loki. And I want to thank you for the work that you did, telling your story, and for being here today. And thank you all for being here this evening as well. This is an important conversation, as Lauren just stated. It's not just what happens here. It's not just watching a movie and taking it for fact, but it's the beginning of a dialogue. It's the beginning of an exploration into what's going on. How can we make an impact? How do we find our authentic voice? How do we tell our story? Not run from our story, but share our story in a way that can impact a community, a nation, civilization for generations to come. So I'm really looking forward to having this conversation. I had a chance to walk around the concourse a little bit at the beginning of the documentary with Loki, and I had to stop the conversation and say, okay, look, we're going to spoil the Q&A. But I do want to also reiterate, as Lauren said, at the end of the Q&A that Loki and I have, there will be an opportunity for each and every one of you, whoever has a question, to ask a question. There'll be a microphone that will be located in the center aisle. So if you have a question in mind already, or if something comes up during the course of the conversation, jot it down, commit it to memory, whisper in your neighbor's ear, and have them remind you of what the question is, and we will start this dialogue. Well, welcome to Boise. So it sounds like you've been through Boise, but haven't spent a lot of time in downtown. How's your first visit to downtown Boise been?
Oh, it's great. That's great. Yeah, we spent all day at the different elementary schools, telling my mother's story and sharing that with the students, 5th graders and things, and that her story and that of the civil rights movement. So it's just great kids. It's really fun. Yeah.
Yeah. How is it talking to 5th graders?
You know, they're fun. They're tougher than adults, but at the same time they soak it up. They just really want to know.
Okay. Well, I've had a question in mind all day, and I'm sure it's a question that you probably get as you travel the country talking about the documentary, and I'm sure it's the question that each and every one of you guys is wondering. Who are you rooting for the Super Bowl on Sunday? No, seriously. Watched the film, and I think that it was a great story of, obviously a lot of historical context. And what I know of you from watching this film is that you are an award-winning filmmaker. You are an author. You're a proud son. But I'm just curious, who is Loki? Who beyond this film? Give us a little bit of a look into who you are and how you live your life and what's brought you to this point.
Dang. Okay. Wow.
You weren't ready for that one.
I wasn't ready for that at all. I'm trying to think. Who am I? I'm my mother's son. I was in Jackson, Mississippi, in 2016, and we were at the home of Medgar Evers, where he was assassinated. And my mom and my son were there, and we were there with Rena Evers, his daughter, and a few other people. And introductions were being made. Right? And it was Rena was next to me on my right, my mom was on my left, and someone comes up to me and as they're saying, "Who are you?" I knew if I said, "Well, I'm Loki," the next question was going to be, "Yeah, who are you?" Right? So I just said, "Well, I'm Joan's son." "Oh, okay," and moved on. And Rena leans over and she says, "Don't worry, Loki, I don't have a name either. I'm just Megler's daughter." And and we talked about that later because we both kind of struggle with that identity because you want to be your own person, but we also know at the same time that's who we are identified as, and that's just our responsibility within that identity. And so, who am I? I'm my mother's son. It's a good place to be.
Great place to be. And speaking of Joan, an incredible woman. There was a documentary written about your mother, an ordinary hero, I believe. And listening to this story, reading a little bit about her, she was no ordinary hero. She was extraordinary. Thinking about being a teenager, 17, 18, 19 years old, and being put in jail, right? And you look at your shirt, right? My mom's an ex-con. She was marching with the freedom fighters. She was on the front lines. And she also found out, right, that her ancestors owned slaves. So what got her to the point where she became an activist after finding out this myth that was actually a fact, that owned slaves?
First, I gotta say that she's still mom, and that whole nonviolence thing and the civil rights movement that ended when she had children. We got spanked all the time, and somehow thinks we deserved it. But my mom, it was interesting. Yeah, she grew up with all this. I mean, you said in the film she didn't know the N-word was a bad word until she was 13. It was as common as dirt, she would say. And but she believes in the principles that you do unto others, you have to do unto you. You done the least of these, my brethren, you done unto me, and the Declaration of Independence that says all men are created equal. And she really took that to heart. She said, I take things very literally. And that just really motivated her. So she goes to Oconee, Georgia, where her family, her grandmother lives and stuff, and goes to the black quarters and really sees that separate but equal is not right. And for this first time, she really just understands, what's going on, and says, this is wrong. I'm going to do something about it. And that just became that motivation. And when she got the chance, she made the leap. Actually, it was, this today is the anniversary of the Greensboro sit-in, February 1st, 1960. And my mother wanted to go to a school in Ohio, a little small church school, that her Sunday school teacher had gone to college. And her Sunday school teacher was actually John Glenn, the astronaut. But my grandmother, was afraid that, that she would have a black roommate or a black classmate and these sort of things. And so sent her to Duke University because it was a state school. And it was the worst place she could send her because 53 miles away is the Greensboro sit-in. The very next sit-in to take place is in Durham, where she is. And she gets invited to join the movement. I was telling these kids today, I said, you think about those four guys, those four students. Within 3 months, 70,000 people were doing sit-ins. Just 4 guys decided that, they're sick and tired of being sick and tired, to quote Van Hamer, right? It was just, I'm going to do something. And that's remarkable. And, that's what we're doing here at the same time. It's just, making a decision to do something. I mean, coming here tonight is making a decision to do something. There's so many other things you can do, so I thank you.
Absolutely. Well, and kind of a poignant statement that she made, that it starts with a step, it starts with a decision, right? There's no monumental, sometimes we think that in order to make impact, you have to make some monumental declaration, but it just starts with a commitment and a choice. And you shared with me earlier today a quote that your mother had said. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, get the internet to work here, let's see. One moment, let's see. It's incredible build up here, I know.
I know, right? Anticipation. It was a really good quote.
She says, I couldn't make a difference if I did nothing.
Couldn't make a difference if I did nothing. It's so easy to do nothing, right? But just a little amount, a little step has a profound impact. I was watching, I think there's a Patriots fan in the audience here somewhere, right? So I was watching the Tom versus Time documentary on Facebook about Tom Brady. He's 40 years old and he's going against time, Mother Nature. And he was talking, they were showing him working out this off season prior to this season. And one of his trainers talked about, a lot of quarterbacks are trying to get 5 or 10% better every offseason, and Tom's trying to get like 0.5% better, right? And that's what's led him to greatness. It hasn't been these monumental leaps that got him to be great. It's been micro movements, and micro movements can, right, if done correctly and with commitment and consistency, can be pretty powerful.
A lot of a little's a lot.
A lot of a little is a lot. Fantastic. Well, so, I'm really curious in watching this video, what was the tipping point for you in realizing, you tell the story, the myth that, your family owned 100 slaves and 99 of them stayed because they were family and they were treated so well, but to come to find out that there's only 6 slaves and 5 of them left. What was that moment that the awakening happened? Was it like, Santa Claus, you're 8 years old and you stumble into your parents' room and you find the presents under the bed and you're like, oh, Santa doesn't exist? And that, our family didn't have slave owners or slaves? Or like, what was that moment that you realized?
There really wasn't, for me, a specific moment because we grew up with that. We knew that. I was in high school when my aunt, my mom's sister, did some genealogy work and found out that the 100 slave story wasn't true. And, really, if you went to Oconee and saw how people lived, it was very evident. But for me, what's interesting, I was actually just listening to an interview I had done with my aunt. And this was in 2011, when I was working on the film about my mother. And in the interview, she talks about Aunt Mary. But I wasn't listening for Aunt Mary. I was listening for stories about my mom. And those records, I had those records the entire time. But I wasn't ready to see her. She was just, just another name and another, on the ledger, slave ledger. It was just, she was invisible to me. If there was a particular tipping point, I don't remember if it's in this version of the film. This is such a condensed version. I'm not trying to upsell you here, but that's such a condensed version of the film. There's so much more information on the DVD.
They can purchase it.
Yeah, they can purchase it. Yes, but it's when I'm reading those deeds of their deeding people to other people. It was just that's when it really hit home. It's like, wow, my family was involved in human trafficking.
A couple years ago, and maybe members of the audience, and you remember this, Ben Affleck was going through the process of finding out, about his family, the PBS show, fascinating show. And when he found out, they discovered, and the professor informed him that his ancestors were slave owners. He fought tooth and nail to make sure that was scrubbed from the record. That episode, that story, would not include the fact that his ancestors were slave owners. There was letters written. It was a controversial subject and topic. We hear about these different, institutions of higher learning who are trying to reconcile, dormitories or buildings that are named after, their founders who were slave owners. Or, all these stories keep coming up. And so at a time when that is still taking place here in 2017, 2018, what does it take for someone to own it, right? I'm in so many conversations around diversity and inclusion, and people are like, why can't we just forget about that? Like, it happened, it has nothing to do with me, I wasn't a slave owner.
Well, Louvain, he doesn't say this in the film, he says it to me, he goes, no one likes to think of themselves as a son of a bitch, And that's just kind of like no one likes to think of their family that way either. And, you are not your family. Now, I have definitely benefited from my family's history, and not just from a societal standpoint, but very, very directly, right? And it's not so much that you should feel guilty for the sins of your fathers. It's you have a responsibility because of that to be aware and to know. And the biggest problem we have is just the way our history's been written. It's so distorted, and that's why people just put up those walls. They just can't believe that oh my gosh, George Washington had slaves. Well, that's not a newsflash, but they've created such gods in these books that we can't even touch them. And when you start breaking down those walls for people, it's uncomfortable and it's disheartening, and so you're trying to cling to what you know. I mean, I was just thinking about this the other day, this nostalgia sort of thing of like, you don't make them like they used to, right? I'm like, I was thinking about like cars and stuff. People like these hot rods. They don't make them like they used to. I'm like, thank goodness. I mean, those things were death traps, right? I mean, there are improvements, right? I mean,
Horrible gas mileage.
right, yeah. I mean, so, yeah, quit clinging to the past and recognize what's going on in the present. All that stuff flows. We're all downstream of the past.
You mentioned uncomfortable, so let's get to the uncomfortable truth. So the initial release was October 2017.
Was it?
That's what I read. That's what I read on with Wikipedia.
Oh, all right.
So Wikipedia
It's on
is the
Wikipedia.
Bible. Yes,
Oh,
yes.
all right. I didn't know
So,
Man.
what was there an event, a catalyst for you wanting to start this journey and tell your story publicly?
Well, it was in the film it talks about, it's with Lavon. He's just like, everyone knows where the drugs are. You never see a SWAT team raid university. When I first wrote the film, the original title of the film was actually called Why You're a Racist and Didn't Even Know It. And it was really meant to be this really kind of pointed, stabbing sort of thing. So I was reading all this stuff and just really getting frustrated. And how come, they have these conversations and people just like, oh, you're just making all this up, It's like, wow, And then I got to a point where I told my mom, I said, I'm just not going to make this film. Now I've been researching this for 6 years. And, she's a mom, right? She's like, no, you worked on so hard, blah, you need to do this. And I'm like, okay, whatever, mom. And, and I literally just said, all right, well, I'm just going to pray about it. I'm a praying man. And took the Lord and said, all right, what do you want me to do with this thing? And the next day, my wife and I are on a walk. I know exactly where we were. And we're on a walk, and the Holy Ghost said, check your family history. And at that, just a split second later, that 100-slave story came back. And I hadn't thought about that story in 20 years since my grandmother passed away. But I can see the entire film in my head. And I turned to my wife and said, it's done. The film's done. But it said, check your family history. And that wasn't a check, that was just a memory. And that's when I started digging in and found out about John Chandler and, Jamestown and all that sort of stuff. And then, and as a matter of fact, on my dad's side, we go straight back to Charles Carroll of Carrollton. He's the last living signer of the Declaration of Independence. He's also one of the largest slaveholders in the country. He believed in the abolition of slavery, just not while he owned it. It's just bad for the family business, right? But that became that point of this is the story that needs to be told. And the whole journey cascades from that.
We're so glad that you did. And there's a nice balance between obviously the personal anecdotes and stories and history and data. And the thing that stood out to me was actually just the name of the movie, The Uncomfortable Truth. So can we start with the notion of being uncomfortable? That kind of resonated with me in an interesting way. Can you take us into the heart of what that exactly means as it pertains to being a descendant of slaves or telling the story? Because after watching the opening stanza, I was wondering, is being uncomfortable with the fact that you own slaves, or uncomfortable with the fact that you weren't a prominent owner of slaves, right? Because it felt like, owning 100 slaves was fine, but 6, we don't want anybody to know it was just 6 and that 5 of them left.
That, in all honesty, I don't remember if I said it in this version, but it was, I was disappointed. I really was. I was just like, wow. It was just like my grandmother. It was, while my grandmother was really well off, my mom and her had, they were obviously, did not get along. My mom was fiercely independent, so we've grown up on government cheese, right? And school meals and those sort of things. And so having that 100-slave story meant that we were somebody, right? And not having it meant we weren't. Not the ramifications of anything else. And so, but the real sense of the title of The Uncomfortable Truth is really more about the uncomfortable truth of our history of our country that's not being told, and the history of racism in America. That's the real uncomfortable part, because it's a conversation no one ever wants to have. They pop something on Facebook, which is, of course, I just pop something on Facebook, right? So, but they feel that they've just done their part. You know, there's Facebook activism, right, and or just firing off back and forth, and instead of having this long, drawn-out conversation and dialogue and listening, and there was a gentleman, I'm blanking on his name, but a friend of mine is white, and he's a co-writer on this book, with an African-American gentleman, and he was like, you know, he's learning all this stuff, and he's like, oh my, you know, what can I do, what can I do? And he just says, believe me, just believe me. When I tell you that this stuff happens, just believe me. I think that's just really telling. It's like, no, well, I'm not making this stuff up.
Yeah. Well, I had a conversation with my mother today, telling her about this documentary, and you know, she recalled that, you know, growing up, that her father and grandfather didn't want to talk about this, right? But what was your most uncomfortable moment as you started to journey back and to search and to look for, you know, Mary Harris and to talk to people? What was uncomfortable along the way?
The most uncomfortable moment had to be going all the way back to 1610 and John Chandler, and knowing that we were part of the start of it. That was just. But at the same time, it becomes okay. Well, that gives me an opportunity and a position to speak from as well. Say, look, you know, it's a notorious credibility, but it's at least something to say. You know what? I can speak very clearly to this. I can't dance around any of it.
Right. You can't dance around it, and so often we have these important conversations via Facebook, right? Like people go to Facebook to have a conversation about race, and as soon as it gets heated, right, you're not able to convey your full thoughts. You're not able to win the argument, because it is about winning the argument on Facebook publicly.
Saving face.
Yeah, saving face. And you opened the movie out with that. So what is it about racism that people are afraid to talk about?
It's because they don't want to see themselves as being racist. I mean, that's for me. That's what it comes down to. It's simply they don't want to see how they play a part of that. It's you know, I'm not racist, right? Well, that doesn't mean you're against racism. It's always these sort of qualifiers and stuff, and I think that's probably the biggest. To me, that's the biggest piece, is that they just don't want to admit that they're actually a part of that. You know, like the example I give in the film about my mom. You know, she still has these racist tendencies, and how could you not? I mean, she grew up in America, right? I mean, you know, she was fed the same diet as the rest of us, but she's willing to actually recognize it and do something with it. You know, okay, well, why did this come to mind? What happened? You know, what was the situation? And work through that. And you have to be, you know, really willing to open yourself up, get uncomfortable, and go there.
You know, the Oz principle talks about, so, you know, everyone, we're an action-oriented society, right? So it's all about action and what the results are. But in order to get to the action, it's about the beliefs and the experience. And if you want to change an outcome, you have to change the action. If you want to change an action, you have to change the experience. If you want to change an experience, you have to change the belief, right? That's the root cause, is the beliefs affect all decisions that we make. And so when we talk about racism versus bias, what's the distinction between those two? Can we reconcile, is there a conflation of the two these days, do you think?
I think of bias, and I think of, gosh, yeah, it's like this, you know, it's reverse racism, right? You know, it's like, well, okay, well, hold on. I mean, well, first of all, we have to understand that, you know, that race doesn't even exist. It's a social construct. Genetically speaking, you know, there really is only one human race. So when you hear people go, I just believe in the human race. Well, actually, that's actually a real accurate thing to say. They just don't realize what they're saying. And color is very real. You know, if you don't see color, then something's very wrong. Because if you don't see color, then you don't actually see what's really going on. You're trying to ignore everything. It's that being colorblind. So it's when we put value on color, that's where you get, you know, the classic term of racism. And you're putting, well, black people do this, or Mexicans do that, or whatever it is. White people apparently never do anything. It's white people, they never think that way about themselves. So a bias, someone can be, anyone can be biased. That's not a, that's just, anyone can. It doesn't matter what race you are, what color you are, right? But racism specifically is the institution side of that. And that's where the challenge becomes is most white people will see racism as, whites and blacks see racism very differently. Most white people will see racism as, well, that's the lunch counters, and that's the buses, and that's the old black and white photographs, right? They don't see the institution of that, or it's the N-word, right? But they don't see the institution of racism, the underlying value. So I would say to my mom, we speak sometimes together, at an event or something. And I said, one time I just flippantly said, well, yeah, you guys, civil rights movement, you guys took care of all the low-hanging fruit. You took care of the easy stuff. And that just lit her up, of course. And afterwards, she was like, wait, where are you getting at with that? And I said, well, let's just be frank. I mean, that's literally what it was. Now, those are very, very important things. The outward-facing manifestations of racism is very important psychologically, that you don't have separate bathrooms, you don't sit on the back of the bus, and these sort of things. I said, but that foundation of racism, you never took care of that. And that's why we continue to always have these problems. That's what appears in the film, talking about that. They just rebuild, take the same material and just restructure it, right? Until we're willing to take out our collective pickaxes and start getting at it. And that's not just societal, but also personal, because we have our own personal foundations, which is a reflection of that society in general.
Right. I was going to wait till later to talk about systemic and institutional racism, but since you brought it up.
All right, well.
Yeah, I worked in corporate America for 20 plus years, and was confronted with it on a daily basis. Right, it exists. And maybe I thought I lived in a utopian society, or maybe I was naive or just hopeful. That you didn't think that, you knew it was prevalent at the highest levels of this country, right? But you didn't think it would just be thrown in your face, right? So on a daily basis, we turn on the news and we see the highest office in the land denigrating women and people of color daily with no retribution, right? No one holding them accountable for what they're saying. We see, leaders making these statements, and at the same time, supporting neo-Nazis or white supremacists and encouraging them or sending out dog whistles. And so how can we reconcile what's going on now in 2018? These conversations are no longer kind of behind closed doors.
Oh,
These conversations are front and center on a daily basis with the most powerful person in the world.
What's your question? Sorry.
Right.
I got caught up with that. I was like, whoa, all right.
So how do we impact institutional racism? Because if we do talk about this, the foundational principles, it's the root cause, right, of racism, discrimination, right? It comes from our beliefs and our values. Right. How can we, right, as individuals, as collective organizations, how can we impact that? White, black, and differently.
Well, first and foremost, call it when you see it. And there might be, we talked about this with the kids today, there's what's right and what's easy are not always the same thing. And there's consequences to those actions. And when you do what's right, when you know what's right, there's always those people who are going to be opposed to it. And you have to be ready for that. And yeah, that might mean your job. I think of the bus boycott in Birmingham. Bus boycott went on for a year. People walked 20 miles in the rain and snow and stuff to get to work and back, right? It wasn't until it got so economically uncomfortable that they finally caved, right? And we are a capitalist society, and every successful demonstration, it ends up being something super successful. It ended up being that it was an economic hit on them. Whether it's the Jackson downtown boycotts or the Birmingham bus boycotts, and everything that what Dr. King got assassinated for was trying to bring poor whites and poor blacks together to see that they had a common cause. It's all economics. Follow the money, and that's where you're going to find it. But on a personal level, it comes back to just taking that step and being willing to speak it and to call it when you see it. Yeah, you might not make some friends. I've had people. My employer, I work for an education-based company, and I got hate mail sent to my employer saying that they should fire me because I'm a racist against cops and this, that, and this, and blah, blah, blah. I was like, okay, I didn't know cops were a race, but nonetheless. I remember, my boss came downstairs and he's like, yeah, we just got this letter and so forth. I'm like, oh. And he said, I said, you can't tell me who it is. He goes, no. I said, what's the initials? He told me. I said, I know who it is, right? And because he had gotten in an argument with me on Facebook, so I knew exactly who it was. And I said, well, what do you, I said, I guess I should probably start packing my boxes, right? He says, no, we're just trying to figure out how to tell them how to go to hell politely, right? And I was fortunate that way, that my employers, understand what I'm doing from an education standpoint and support that. That's not common. But that willingness to say things that other people don't want to say is the first step in recognizing it and doing it. Call them on.
When you mentioned kind of racism against cops, so while we're there, let's talk about the Black Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter movement, as
All
if they can't,
matter.
as if they are mutually exclusive.
Right.
A few weeks ago, it's probably a month or so ago, on 60 Minutes, they profiled the former white supremacist. I see some folks shaking their heads. Did you guys see? Anybody see that? So it was on 60 Minutes. They had a former Klansman, and he was talking about that several years ago, the leadership in those organizations made a strategic decision that they were going to come out of hiding, and they were going to start hiding in public, and they were going to do so by, trading their trading their boots for suits. Kind of hiding or masking their tattoos, getting normal haircuts, and most alarmingly to me was infiltrating law enforcement positions, right? So they were encouraging these members of neo-Nazi organizations, white supremacists, Klansmen, to start applying for jobs in law enforcement, and that would allow them to do a couple things. One would be they can recruit, and two, leverage the power that you have. And that was frightening to me because this is going on, right? And people are complaining about it, and people are like, y'all need to stop complaining about people getting shot, right? They had a weapon on them, or whatever it is. And so we talk about the Black Lives Movement. Like I don't understand that we see it on film, right? What's the difficulty in accepting and understanding or being able to say, yes, Black lives do matter?
It's always comes back to the us versus them. That's been ingrained in us. I was at this 4th of July thing in Utah, and it was like the largest American flag to ever fly over the U.S. sort of thing. And it was really interesting because I like poking the bear every now and then. So I show up with a Black Lives Matter T-shirt, and I sit down next to this lady, and she goes, "All lives matter." I said, "Thank you for supporting Black Lives Matter. I'm glad to hear that." Because if you say all lives matter, then you definitely believe that Black lives matter, right? I said, but saying Black lives matters doesn't mean that any other life doesn't matter. It's just like saying save the rainforest doesn't mean forget all the other forests. It's just that there's a unique situation taking place within the black community and law enforcement and so forth, and that needs attention. And I did the same thing with someone who was like, oh, well, Blue Lives Matter, and I'm like, yeah, well, I'm glad you support Black Lives Matter, because if you really think Blue Lives Matter, right, and that's your really big thing, then you should be hand in hand with Black Lives Matter, because you should be working together. Because if you think that there is a problem that you have to shoot people and that police officers are getting shot in a black community, then shouldn't you be there supporting this community-driven opportunities to be involved in the black community that you so fear? Then you won't have your blue lives getting killed, right? If you are actually working together. They didn't think that. But yeah, I mean, you have to find your allies and so forth. And that was this, but they're so ingrained with that mentality. What do you do with that at that point? It's something you just can't argue with. You have to say your piece and be done and go, okay, well, that's that, and move on. Some people just won't change, but some will.
Well, and what's the balance, right, between just being so frustrated and infuriated and wanting them to understand it
Right.
versus being able to meet them where they are and get them to a point where they have a better understanding?
Don't-
Share your story real quick.
Yeah. Too often we go from 0 to 100 really quick on some of these things, and we jump straight to the end, right? And we just go to guns. And I ran into a situation where I had a gentleman had said to me, well, is the Confederate flag racist? I was like, wow, that's a stupid question. Of course it is. And my inside voice, of course. And I was like, okay, well, maybe he's actually being genuine in his question. Maybe he's not trying to tick me off. And I said, well, what does a Confederate flag represent? His response shocked me. He said, I don't know. I was like, oh, okay. Well, now there's a place to begin. Instead of assuming that he was trying to, because I knew who this person was and so forth, that he was just, trying to tick me off, which is my normal response. I did the opposite and was like, okay, well, let me just try to see where he's at. And meeting people where they are at and accepting that limitation, I grew up learning about the civil rights movement. We had civil rights people in our house all the time. I had no idea that people didn't learn this stuff. It blew my mind when I found, we did a screening of my mom's story in Mississippi, an Ole Miss, and college-educated kids came up to us and said, we never learned any of this. And I literally said, how is this possible? 70% of this movie takes place in your state. Now, my first response to myself was, well, it's Mississippi. Of course, I'm not going to teach this. But that wasn't the case. They just don't teach it. I was like, wow. It's so, a lot of these people just don't know anything. And we would like to assume they would. We like the internet. I mean, all this massive web of information. But all we check out is the football scores, right? And so with this gentleman, it was like, okay, I'm going to dial this back and have this conversation with him. He said, well, I don't know. I said, well, it represents the countries that, the states that seceded from the Union. Oh, yeah, okay. I was like, okay, well, maybe he thought I was trying to trick him, right? And I wasn't. I said, so why did they secede? He said, state rights. I'm like, oh, okay. Take a deep breath. And I said, the right to do what? Right? I don't think he ever thought of it. And he's like, to own people? I said, right. Is slavery racist? He said, yes. I mean, it was instant. It's a given, I would hope. I said, so thus, the Confederate flag is, he said, racist. I said, right. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment. They had all those Confederate flags flying on the Capitol buildings of all the southern states and stuff. I said, there's this big uproar about taking them down. I said, why were they flying up there to begin with? He says, well, weren't they always flying there? I said, no, they didn't start flying there until 1956 in response to Brown versus Board in 54. Right? It wasn't before that. All of a sudden, it became a symbol of segregation. That, and the states are not going to let the federal government tell us what to do. We believe in segregation. I said, is segregation racist? And he goes, yeah. I said, okay. Thus, the Confederate flag is racist. And that took a while, that was a conversation, right? And it wasn't a Facebook, blast or anything else. It was actually just real conversation, sitting down and actually taking the time to actually listen to what the other person was thinking and going through and so forth. I really condensed it down. But that was really, that's what it really comes down to is just listening and understanding where people are coming from.
Well, so that sounds like being an ally, right? So we talk about that a lot, allyship. What does that look like? What does it take to be a good ally? How can you support allies? And so there's a colleague of ours here at Boise State who uses the term, the phrase quite often, racial battle fatigue. And states that in reference to that oftentimes for underrepresented populations, you are the one, right, that is, if you're in a conversation, if you're in a classroom, if you're in a board meeting and you're the only person there, then they expect you to speak on behalf of the entire universe of Black people, LGBTQ people, whatever, right? And it's tiring, right? And so we need allies. And it's also true that the individuals who are invited to the golf course, that are invited to have scotch up in the penthouse suites, probably don't look like us, right? They look like you. And they're the ones that are able to infiltrate and have that conversation and ask those questions.
Yeah, it's interesting, I had this conversation with Levon about the civil rights movement. It was one of these things where it was like, people really didn't care, meaning white segregationists and so forth, didn't care about African Americans trying to get their rights and so forth and getting beaten up and killed and so forth, because they've been doing it for years. It's only suddenly when white people started getting beaten up and killed that all of a sudden, oh, this is an issue, right? Which is interesting. And so you need those voices. It's unfortunate that's what it takes, and maybe something might have happened without those allies. But who knows? So the same sort of thing, it's when the people who look like you start talking about the same things that people don't look like you, all of a sudden, well, maybe there's something to listen to. Because, Levon is the angry black man, right? And I literally had someone who watched the film and stopped like halfway through and called me up. I said, man, I can't get through this guy. I mean, he's just angry. Like, really? And I intentionally started Levon off with, no, I never liked white people. That was totally intentional. That wasn't in the beginning of his interview. That was like towards the end. I put that in the beginning because I was like, yeah, I really want a white audience to go, well, wait a second, why don't you like me, right? I said, just keep watching the film. By the time he got to the end of the film, he calls me up. He goes, oh, I get it. Because he actually agreed with Levon. He had to go through that process of breaking down those walls and getting to that point where he's like, wow, okay. Taking that time, it was interesting.
Well, I'm going to ask a couple more questions, but if anyone has a question, please feel free to, there'll be a microphone right here in the center aisle, so please feel free to step up and ask some questions. Intersectionality is a phrase that people use quite a bit lately. How do things like LGBTQ, immigration, Me Too, Time's Up, how do all these things fit into the discussion and the dialogue about race?
Well, I mean, they all intersect. I mean, if someone's going to be a racist, they're probably also just a sexist. They kind of go ahead, because it's a superiority thing. It's a power thing. It's like, well, I mean, it's just pretty transparent at that point. But yeah, I mean, if it happens to one of us, it's going to happen to all of us. And so we should care. I mean, if we believe in human rights and we believe that we're all God's children and these sort of principles, then we believe it for everybody.
In the film, there's a point where you talked about, I think in the 40s and 50s, is the polarization pivoted around race, right? That's where you saw the divide. And I was at an event recently where a dean here in Boise State talked about the polarization now pivots around political affiliation. Right. So and race is still there, economic status is still there, a lot of different things, and gender. But really, there's a polarization around being Democrat or Republican. And the starting point of this was right around 2009, 2010.
I venture it started with Lincoln as well. I mean, but what's interesting to think about that though as well is that how the parties just flip back and forth. I mean, Republican, Lincoln was a Republican, right? And then Republicans love to say that. Oh, well, it's the Democrats who did all this horrible stuff. Well, yeah, I mean, Democrats were in the South were the segregationists, But hey, they all fled to Ronald Reagan after that, right? I mean, Reagan goes to Neshoba County in 1980 to declare his presidency. Neshoba County is where, 14 years earlier, 16 years earlier, they had murdered Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. Right? And he knows what he's doing. He goes to that place and says, it's state rights. Right? I mean, it's a game. and of politicians. I could go off about politicians, but yeah, you get these camps, and it's us versus them, and they just trade back and forth. And let's keep we just keep fighting with each other, and they just keep making more money. Right? So
Money and power.
yeah.
Any questions? Anybody? Oh.
Hello, I'm going to look this way. You said some people won't change and some will. Like you, in my own family, I have addressed racism, I would say hugely unsuccessfully. So I'm looking for a new strategy. And maybe I've got just the people that won't. I don't know. When I bring up the idea of slavery and the impact and the lasting and the still problem, my family's like, that was so long ago. And specifically, I'll talk to my dad, who's going to be 89 next month. He's Irish. When he was a boy, the Irish were discriminated against. And it was tough to be an Irish kid. I'm like, Dad, you were white. You could blend. It's not like you spoke the Irish brogue. And we don't have that problem anymore. So what do you do with that? Well, we worked hard, and I pulled myself up, and the Italians pulled themselves up, and that whole, if we allow that there's still lasting effects, then somehow it takes away from the different other more light-skinned groups that had struggles coming here when they came. I'm just curious to know if you figured this one, how to go about this conversation, because I haven't.
Yeah, being Irish and English, which is what my family history is. And that's just, I don't know how that happened. They never got along. But taking that history alone of how the English treated the Irish and so forth, and how that impeded the growth of the Irish, and creating those parallels might be a way of doing it. Sometimes it's just they don't want to listen to, family members because, well, I don't want to accept the idea that my family member knows more than me. So having something else that you can present to do that, but trying to create, again, coming back to those parallels and seeing how those impediments, maybe it might be asking, it's like, what would your life have been if you weren't discriminated against as an Irish, right? And try to take them down that path. You go, well, yeah, I mean, gosh, it's kind of like what happened to African Americans and so forth. If going all the way back to slavery is too tough, I mean, there were Irish people who were slaves. I mean, there were Indians who were slaves, right? But it came to a point where, well, you can't enslave Christians, because they have souls that are worth redeeming and so forth. So we got to declare, African American, Africans heathens, and that's because they're heathens. They don't have souls, so you can enslave them, right? That's what that all was all about. And so seeing that, where they fit into that timeline and the impact of it that happened. I mean, it's kind of sad to say, but it's really it's a lot of this is just economics. It really is. It just I'm gonna get super political here for a moment, but that's the card Trump plays all the time. It's really an economic thing. It's the immigrants are taking your jobs and things like that. I mean, it's this total fear factor. We're gonna bring back the jobs, the factories, and this, that, and this, and whatever else. And it's just like it's the lowest common denominator. And segregation was. Some people get offended by it. People understand and won't get offended by this, but it impacted poor whites as well, because it's economics. And yeah, they had this little thing that, well, at least you're not black, right? They can give you that, but the wage suppression for African Americans suppressed the wages for whites, right? I only have to pay you 2 cents more, and you're going to feel better about it, but you're still making $20 less than what you could make, right? But hey, guess what? At least you're not black. And the only people making money were the people who owned all the factories and everything else. And so that game was played. That's why with Dr. King, when it was, man, if we actually get these people together in the same room and they figure this out, it's over. So, gotta kill them. 50 years ago, this April.
and that's, present here in the Treasure Valley, the Basque community, right? So when the Basque came here, they were second-class citizens, if you will, a little darker complected maybe than, people that resided here prior to them. And they came here for economics, right? So they were the sheep herders because they were sheep herding jobs. They were, the gold diggers, right? So because there was jobs to help bring them out of the economic strife, and when they started to be able to speak the language is when there was a little bit more integration.
My mom knew that her mother was never going to change, but she also, was like, you're not going to use this type of language around my kids. So while she couldn't change her mother's opinions, she could at least shield us and move forward, right? And at least her dad, or her mom knew where she stood. And that just might be it. My grandmother went to the grave thinking the way she thought, But she also knew what my mom thought. And she didn't change my mom, but my mom definitely impacted the rest of us.
I'll come to you, Cynthia.
And it's sad. I mean, the impact of racism on your father. I mean, look at the richness of the opportunities he could have had, relationship-wise and everything else with other people. I mean, and how does that eat at you? I mean, it's just, gosh. I think about that for my own grandmother. I mean, she really was a wonderful person. How much more amazing she could have been if she didn't have, this racist white supremacist attitude. It's really unfortunate.
So friends and I have talked about how we're part of the Sesame Street generation, and growing up thinking that interracial relationships were just normal and an acceptable way to be. So not having ideas like you can't be friends with people of different races or whatever, that all the superficial forms of racism were unacceptable. And so we've all spoken out about them and have friends of many different cultures and races. However, what's been new to me is learning about systemic racism. That was not discussed on Sesame Street or in school. And I'm today learning more. I've learned more in other conversations with friends. But all the economic structures that are still in place, so there's historical structures that have impacts, like your discussion of the GI Bill and how most American families build wealth is through home ownership. And since that was not accessible to black families, the ongoing impacts of that today, that was an eye-opener for me just tonight. I feel like I need a whole education on the systemic racism that exists today, because it's very easy for white people to just say, well, why don't they just pull themselves up by their bootstraps?
If you own some boots.
But there's this lingering perception, and for those that aren't intrinsically racist, who are intrinsically open, but just don't know. That's me and a lot of my friends.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Education and economics, all that plays together. The war on drugs. I mean, they literally, the war on drugs. The Nixon's White House, representatives have said it had nothing to do with drugs. There wasn't even a drug problem when the war on drugs was declared, by the way. Crime was in decline. It was all about getting after the hippies who were against the war and going after black leaders, right? So civil rights and anti-war. That's what the war on drugs was about. And the policies that came out of that, and it's a real simple cycle from education and so forth. So if you commit a crime, you can't get government grants for education, you can't get welfare, you can't get this, that, and this, right? So you've created this vicious cycle of no education, and then crime, and then no education, and crime, and the poverty rate of that. Well, going all the way back slavery, right? We don't want slaves to be able to read and write, because if they can, they might be able to actually read the Declaration of Independence, and then the whole jig is up, right? But coming out of that, now you're into Jim Crow, and we're still, one-room schoolhouse shacks, Plessy versus Ferguson, right? But equal. I mean, they were even segregating school books, white school books and black school books, in different buildings. That's how insane it was, right? This was in Georgia. But now you have that education, being suppressed, right? And that just flows. Now that was only 50 years ago that this was taking place. So one generation ago, you had people who were getting the worst education you could possibly get. How are you going to win with that? Right? So it's not that far off from where we are. I mean, ghettos were created. In this version, you don't actually get all that, but ghettos were literally created. In the North, a black neighborhood was 90% white in the 1890s. Those same neighborhoods by the 1930s and 40s were 70 or 80% black. I mean, so it's like this constant herding and so forth, and then the jobs flee to the suburbs, right? Now there's no tax base, whereas 70% of funding comes from for education comes from the local tax base. So now you have no jobs, there's no taxes, there's no education, right? There's no education. How am I going to get the jobs? And then 80% of jobs are filled through networking. Well, if everyone in my office is white and all my friends are white when I go home in my neighborhoods and everything else, well, who do I hire? I had that discussion at Brigham Young University. We were doing a screening of this film, and I said, as a Latter-day Saint, which I am, I'm a member of the church. I said, I love it when someone says, that's a really white church. I'm going, well, actually, there's more people of color in the church than there are white members. I love saying that because I go, what? Really? I don't tell them it's all outside the U.S. But I said that, and everyone, in this audience said, oh yeah, that's great. And I said, if that's the case, then how come our flagship school does not represent that diversity? Don't tell me there's not, of the millions of people in the church, that you can't find, some Polynesians, some Hispanics, some blacks, some Japanese, some Chinese members who work in education that can't, that can't be here, right? And that their students aren't there. And there's a comfort zone and all that as well. But that should be representative. But because we live in a very, hyper-segregated society, that's not just Mormons, that's just everywhere. I mean, you don't hear it in the film, but I say that a little bit in my growing up. We had the Southeast Asian refugees from Vietnam War and so forth and whatnot at our schools, but my neighborhood was all white. We had one, I honestly don't remember if he even had a family. I just remember there was one black guy. He was always out on Saturday afternoons washing his red Corvette. I thought that was the coolest thing, right? That was the only black guy in the neighborhood. Everyone else was segregated in different places. We all went to the same schools, but we all went back to our own homes, right? That was 1970s, 1980s. It's still the exact same. That's our society. The most segregated schools in the country today are in the most diverse city in the world, New York.
Well, and there was a recent example of this, right, just in the school system. About a month ago, I was in a conversation with a local teacher, elementary school, who is implementing mindfulness training programs for elementary students, which is remarkable. I think a lot of adults could use that as well. And at that same time, in Baltimore, we all saw, right, where kids were going to school and there was no heat in the school. So already, first and second, third graders, they're going to be on a different path, already, just because of that one situation. But to answer your question as well, there's a couple of resources that you can use. One is The New Jim Crow. Is a fantastic book by Michelle Alexander, and there's a quote that she had.
Well, there's When Affirmative Action Was White. That's a great one. And I'm glad you're like, I want to dig deep on that, because the film is not meant to be this answer to all these questions and so forth. It's really, you could do, people have a whole film just on the war on drugs or just on GI Bill and whatever else. This was just kind of more to give you this general timeline and taste of things and how this all flows together, and then hopefully, one would dig in and go, okay, well, I really want to understand why this, and this, and this. Even how the 13th Amendment, slavery never really ended. And I say that, people are like, what? I'm like, no, it really is true if you really understand how it works. And that system still continues today. We just don't call it slavery, and we don't call it, the system that followed. My brain's trying to figure out what that word was, but during right after slavery, during Jim Crow and so forth, those prison farms. The prison farm system worked like this. After slavery, if you didn't have a job, you were going to get arrested. Right? No loitering law, anti-loitering laws. Well, who's going to hire you? Definitely not the white people. So now you're going to get arrested and you're going to get thrown back in prison on these prison farms, and they're going to sell you back to the plantations. That's literally what would happen. So that was the system that perpetuates. And today we have the same system, but it's the war on drugs, right? To me, it's amazing that heroin is now, opioids and heroin are now a health crisis, right? Well, not a felony, and suddenly it's legal to sell marijuana. When white people can make a profit off of it, suddenly it's okay. It's amazing, and and now that white people are impacted by heroin and opioids and stuff like that, suddenly we have to think about the mental health, think about this, think about that, treatment and so forth. Whereas for everyone else, it was always just throw them in jail, throw them in jail, throw them in jail, and those jails are private jails that are that literally on their statements and Wall Street statements and so forth are like, yeah, we need more prisoners. That's our lifeblood. And you have judges who are literally taking children and throwing them into jail. And there would be judges who are actually getting arrested for this and stuff. This is recent, the past couple of years.
Like having to pay hundreds of dollars for a phone call.
Yeah, all this.
Yes, crazy. What was the name of the book that you mentioned? I think we had a couple people that were writing it down.
When affirmative action was white. There's also the combination of blackness. There's a really good one about the prison systems coming out of slavery.
Hey, Loki, I appreciate the research you did in your film. Could you explain, because I'm constantly told I live in a Christian nation, the relationship between racism and Christianity?
The relationship between racism and Christianity.
Christianity seems to have no effect or influence on racism.
Has no effect?
Well, I mean, with the expansion of Christianity, as mentioned, I'm constantly told I live in a Christian nation, but the persistent racism seems to have had no effect in regards to Christianity and the values associated with religion, be it your religion or other religions.
Man.
I mean, what is your research?
That's deep.
Okay.
That's good. No, go. Continue, please. I'm trying to. My mind is tired, and so I'm trying to calculate all this.
I mean, for example,
please.
There were early blacks that held the priesthood in your church, but when I played for the Broncos in 1976, there's no blacks, holding the priesthood. There's a woman from Chattanooga, Tennessee, a black woman saying that, hey, they brought me up here and they promised that, in the future that will take place.
Yeah, Brigham Young was a racist. Brigham Young, when he found out that there was black priesthood holders who were polygamous with white women, he lost it. And so there's research that's actually that's come out about this, that was more about mixing than anything else. And he was just so focused on this mixing, that's going to be the downfall, whatever, Western society, that we can't have that. And well, of course, that's racist. And apparently, from what I understand, there actually were, after that declaration in 1852, I think it was, there were actually people who did, African Americans did hold the priesthood at certain points in time. Well, then they built a temple down in Brazil. And suddenly it's like, wait a second, these Brazilians are all mixed, African and Native and so forth. You know that's right. And so suddenly it became, this is something we really have to think about now. It was never an official policy, it was a culture. And the church is pretty clear on that. This was never a doctrine and so forth. It doesn't have to be. It was a culture that allowed this to continue. And it still persists on a certain level. I had this conversation where it's like, well, when the church lifts the ban on Africans, anyone with African descent, priesthood, it wasn't like the next day everyone was like, oh, okay, now we're all equal. Now, in theory, yes, right? But while the top said it, it never actually quite trickled down to the bottom, to the congregation. The church comes out with an essay about race. They talk about these things. In my congregation, we have not yet had a single conversation about it. I mean, why? Right? Because it's too uncomfortable. Now the parallel that I gave this person, I said, now the same thing happened when Lincoln freed the slaves. It wasn't like suddenly everyone woke up the next morning going, well, we had a good run. Oh well, I guess we're all equal now. No, we had another 100 years of Jim Crow and segregation, right? Well, the top, and now we're getting institutional racism here, but anyways, even though Lincoln had this epiphany, it never got quite down to everyone else, and we still persist with that. I was in Mississippi, and I was in Sumner, Mississippi, where the trial for Emmett Till took place. And this is 2016. It was the same trip that I had with, I'm going to wrap up with this, the same trip I had with, we went to Megger's home. And we're waiting for the courthouse to clear out so we can shoot some video there and stuff. We're doing this piece about Emmett Till. And I go over to the pharmacy. They're looking for a postcard. And this, the old timer there was, oh, hey, where are you from? And I was like, oh, great, I don't want to start a holy war here. So I'm going to say, he asked where I'm from. I'm from Virginia. Right? And he says to me after that, have you ever been to the Delta? I said, well, actually, I was here a few years back, when I was visiting my mom's cell on death row. He's like, what? I said, oh, she was a freedom rider. Now, I knew what I was doing at this point. And the very next thing he says is, what do you think of the Confederate flag? And I said, well, we're the only country that flies the flag of a loser. And then he went on. He was going on about slavery and how it flew under the flag of the United States longer than in the Confederacy and this, that, and this. And this African-American lady walks in. It's a pharmacy. She walks in to get her prescription. He never looks at her, never stops talking about segregation, in slavery and so forth. She never looks at him, never says a word. She just puts down his money. He hands it off to her, and she walks back out. I'm going, man, she was invisible to him then as she would have been 50 years ago. And I said, I finished the conversation saying, we are a United States. And I punctuated United because I was, again, poking him. I said, and we're trying to form a more perfect union. We're not there yet, but we're trying. And we're all trying to get better. We're never going to be perfect. We can't. Not in this life. But it's the pursuit of that perfection, of trying to be better, and weeding out the wrongs in our lives and in our society is how we do that. Right? And so we walked out there, and it was, my son turns to me and says, that was the weirdest conversation I ever had. I said, Jordan, his robes are in the back. And that was that. And I go across the street to my film crew was with a couple of black state troopers, and I go, you won't believe the conversation we just had. They go, yeah, we believe it. I said, when I told my mom was a freedom rider, man, that set them off. They go, oh, your mom's a freedom rider. Now I'm setting them up. Because I'm thinking, this guy could be making phone calls. Yes, this is 2016, but this is Mississippi, right? And I said to him, I said, so if I got a problem, I call you guys. He said, you believe it? You better believe it. And we got and Duvon Brown, when I told him what we were doing, going to Mississippi with a mixed crew, right? doing about Sumner, and then Emmett Till. He said, "You're going to get to Jackson by nightfall, right? You don't want to be around there at night doing what you're doing." I said, "No, we are." 2016. There's work to do, and that's why we're here. Continue doing that. I want to continue this conversation. I want to expand that. So,
Great question. One last question.
okay, I'm sorry.
It's not so much a question. I just wanted to say I appreciate your film. It was really enlightening. All the people that are in this room are enlightened, or they want to be enlightened. And we have to get information like your film out to other people that don't necessarily want to be enlightened. We have to enlighten them. So, like, we're here at BSU, and we're in this fairly small room when you compare it to other places on the campus. And something like your film should be like a mandatory part of the curriculum, where it's shown to, every class as, are you following me? Yeah, it just needs to be put out there more, so
Yeah.
just the general public will get involved and see the benefit of it.
And I recognize we're preaching to the choir. Everyone here is
Yes.
probably here because they believe in this sort of stuff, right? But the choir still needs to be preached to. That's why the choir is there.
Right.
At Brigham Young, when we did this presentation, they said, "Well, are we making progress?" I said, 20 years ago when I came to Brigham Young, this was never going to happen. We were never going to have a film talking about racism and so forth and these sort of things at Brigham Young. So that's progress, And afterwards, they said the same thing. Every student should be watching this film. And I walked out, and the assistant director to multicultural, whatever, blah, 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 said, "Is there a way for us to do this for every incoming freshman?" Right? Now, that gentleman is African American, right? And it's like, wow, that's progress. The fact that, one, he's got that position, and two, that he's thinking these things, and thinks that this is actually a real possibility. That gives me hope. My mom said to me the other day, she says, it's refreshing when I hear children say, "I can't believe that actually really happened." Now, part of the job is to make sure they never forget that these things happened. But the very fact that they just cannot comprehend that whites and blacks were separated and segregation and all this sort of stuff and people were getting killed and things like that, they can't comprehend it. She goes, that's progress.
I just wanted to add one more thing. We talked about Facebook earlier. I'm a Facebook racism warrior, I tell you. And you can reach people through Facebook. They're going to challenge you. They may not, accept what you have to say, but you're putting thoughts in their head. I just wanted to say I get like 4 or 5 new requests, friendship requests every day. And the other day I just trolled a Republican racist Facebook page, and I made one strong comment. I had 800 and some odd replies to my comment. I mean, most of them were telling me how dumb I was and what I needed to do and different things, but you can reach people. So through Facebook,
And lead with love. Just make sure you lead with love.
Wow.
Well, let's get a youth in here. One last question about the youth.
The future.
We can continue if we like, but.
Sorry, just
Oh.
one last question. So one thing I definitely want to say, I have 2 points. One point, when people say, "Oh, slavery was like 100 years ago," I'm thinking, okay, slavery may have been 100 years ago. That doesn't make it any more worse than it really was. If you look at a lot of documentaries about slavery, and I remember in 5th and 6th grade learning about slavery, when you see slavery, they talk about it like it was nothing, like, oh yeah, these people were in prison or something. This was very real. This was very horrific. It was very inhumane, and I don't think anyone should be saying, "Oh, it was 100 years ago." That doesn't make anything that's worse. And another thing I wanted to ask you was, I think we should also follow the law, even if we don't completely agree with it. If it's the law, it's the law. So if you're not supposed to riot things, don't riot things. If you're not supposed to spray paint trains, don't spray paint trains. So I kind of get confused with this because we still have Confederate statues up in some places, but when we're putting in these, I don't know what's called, papers, people sign. Petitions. When we put in petitions to have them taken down, they're being rejected. It's like they should be standing, but people are taking them down unlawfully, and I'm kind of torn on what to think about. That's kind of my question. So what do you think about that?
Violence only begets violence. And some laws are unjust laws, and like segregation laws were unjust laws, and so that's why they had to be broken. Oh, you're breaking the law. Well, it's an unjust law. Taking down the statues, forcefully like that, there's, like Levon says, there's more to it than just merely someone just knocking it over. There's a history there and so forth, and try to understand that. Is that the right approach? Personally, no. Simply, and this is a very easy thing for me to say. I'm a white guy going, well, no, you shouldn't do that. I'm not in that position of having to fill, the ramifications of what that statue does. However, showing that there's a better way to do something, is always the best way. Because just tearing it down, all you're doing is going to inflame the people who think it should be up to begin with, and you're just going to exacerbate the issue, right? So to me, it's working through the process to get it taken down and changing those minds. And my mom's like, they should stay up, but there should be a plaque on there to tell everyone why it was up to begin with. And they don't even know the history of why. So the education that takes place. I was in Selma, Alabama, with an activist named Joanne Blackman Bland. By the time she was 11 years old, she'd been arrested 13 times. She was on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday and all this. And she takes me over to the cemetery, which is right across from the projects. And in the cemetery is this giant statue dedicated to Forrest, General Bedford Forrest, the founder of the Ku Klux Klan and all this. And they got lights shining on it because they want to make sure that the black projects can see this. It was by design. And we're there, and I'm going, what's this flag? She goes, oh, that's the Confederate flag. I said, no, that's not the Confederate flag. And I said, that's the Confederate flag. She goes, no, that's the Alabama flag. I said, that's not the Alabama flag. That's actually literally the Confederate flag. And I pull up on my phone to show her that the flag that was flying over this cemetery in the United States of America was literally the flag of the Confederate States of America. Not the battle flag, but the Confederate States of America. And she looks at it and goes, what the hell? She could get a picture of that real quick, right? But they are going through a process to try to get this removed. I said, if you're not, then require the school district to have every kid come down to this cemetery and explain to them what this means and what this represents. And then you can sit there and stand there and tell them what it means to you as well. But at least educate these kids. I mean, the white kids and so forth. But make it a requirement. Hey, this is city history anyways. He's a defender of Selma and all this sort of stuff. So make it a requirement. There's different tactics to go about it. But again, as a white person talking about a statue, and here's the peaceful ways to do this, that's really easy for me to say because, again, I'm on the other side of that history than you. But the very fact that, how old are you? 13. The very fact you're here at 13 years old and thinking these things, man, that's hope. That's amazing. So, thank you. We're gonna wrap it up, but we
Yeah.
continue sidebar these and things and so
Exactly.
forth.
Yeah, so he'll be around a little bit, and there are books and DVDs in the back if you guys want to purchase the complete documentary as well. But thank you all for engaging in this discussion. Loki, thank you. As we celebrate Black History Month and honor the men and the women, black and white, who really impacted the advancement of a lot of different people, make sure that you continue having this conversation. As Loki mentioned, it's not about having the answers, the right answer, the solution. It's engaging in the conversation. And we hope that tonight will be the beginning of a beneficial conversation that you guys will have. Thank you.